Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another session of EI Live K-12, the K-12 edition. This is being brought to you by the Earth Institute at Columbia University. My name is Cassie, and I'm the director for the Office of Education and Outreach. And my job is very much geared towards bringing our scientific research to different audiences, including K-12 students and educators. For those of you who are not familiar with the Earth Institute, we are a research organization within Columbia University. And we blend research in the physical and social sciences, education, and practical solutions to guide the process of sustainable development. Experts that make up the Earth Institute include earth scientists, economists, business and policy experts, specialists in public health and law, researchers, teachers, and students. The Institute is actually made up of more than 24 or so research centers and several hundred people who collaborate across many disciplines and schools within the university. What we're hoping to do with these particular sessions is to introduce you to our interdisciplinary work through our experts. We will have sessions until the end of June for K-12 students and educators, and we'll also be expanding on our EI Live series to include additional live stream content. So today, we're very lucky. We're going to be hearing from Erin Blanton from the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. She'll be discussing the basics of energy with us, as well as the resources that provide us with the energy that we need. We'll have Erin do her presentation and then open it up for questions. We're trying a new platform today, actually, to take audience questions, and you'll find this information in the email where you got the link to this YouTube video. But just as a reminder, if you do have a question, we're using onlinequestions.org, O-R-G. Online questions is one word. And our event number is 42720, so today's date. We're going to be monitoring that throughout the presentation, so feel free to add a question at any time you want, and we'll be sure to come back to it at the end. I see that there's actually already a couple of questions there, which is great. So once the session is done, we're going to share a link with everybody who's registered through Eventbrite, so you can access the recording later on. Please email me directly if you have any technical difficulties. And so without further ado, here's Erin.
Great. Thank you so much, Cassie, and to the Earth Institute for organizing this, and for all of you for joining this session. So today we are going to get fired up with energy. And so I just wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about myself. My name is Erin Blanton, and I work at Columbia University's Global Center on Energy Policy. I look at natural gas and other sources of energy, which we're going to be learning about today. And I have been an energy professional for 16 years. And pictured here is my family, my husband, Michael, and my son, Andrew. And under the sweatshirt is my daughter, Heidi, and that is our dog, Midnight. So let's talk about what we're going to go through today. And what I'd like to cover is what is energy and how I'm talking about it today. Where do we use it? Where does it come from? And then I want to give a lot of time, as Cassie said, we're going to take your questions and hopefully I can answer them. So let's start with the question, what is energy? It is, on this definition, power that comes from the use of renewable and non-renewable resources, usually to provide light and heat or to work machines. So that's the definition. We're going to be going into that. So let's start. Let's look first of all at how much energy the world uses. This is the Earth at night, and all of this that is lit up is electricity that's being used at night. And you can see here, you can see the United States is very bright. We've got Europe, and then other countries, India, China, you can see Japan over here. So there's a lot of energy use that happens at night. And the other thing to probably take note of, or you should take note of, is that there are areas that don't have a lot of access to electricity. So you see in Africa in particular. So we need energy. It's very crucial to our lives. And I want us to sort of go into where we use it in our own lives, how are you already using it. And so let's look at how we use it in our homes or in our apartments. And sort of I have a little model here. You can sort of go around. So some of the places that you are using energy already, for example, when you take a shower, you have a bath, you're using the water that's heated, that uses energy. For your bedside light or your overhead lights, that uses energy. When you turn on the television or an AC unit, air conditioning unit, that uses energy, as does a fan. Or if you have a washer and dryer in a building or in your home, those use energy, as does, and the heater for the water. Your refrigerator to keep food cold, to keep food frozen, those things use energy as well. Your oven, that uses energy. How you wash dishes, whether in the sink or through the dishwasher, uses energy. And then appliances like a microwave or a toaster, your television, your iPad, your Chromebook, all of those things use energy. And I kind of want to for us to think a little bit or look into a little bit about which things use the most energy. And here we have a breakdown of sort of a typical American home and what are the key things that we use energy for. And if you see here, the biggest source or use of energy is in heating. And that's when you put on your space heater or your radiator. Heating your home is the biggest one. And that's over 30% usually of the energy that we use in our homes goes to that. And the next piece is really space cooling. Like I said, an air conditioning unit would be space cooling. You may see these in the windows of your home. The other thing is water heating. So when you have a bath or a shower, that's a key one. And then finally on lighting, as I said, the overhead lights, your bedside lights, if you have a night light, all of those things. And those four are really the major source of our energy use in our homes. And I'm sort of pointing that at now because later on, we're going to talk about ways we can save energy. And these are the big ones to think about. All right, so the other component is in transport, because we don't just use energy in our homes, we also use it to get around. And so we need to put energy in cars and trains, buses, subways, airplanes, boats. They all require energy to move. And I'm going to quickly go back to that first slide. And it says power that comes from the use of renewable and non-renewable resources, usually to provide light and heat or work machines. And you need all of those things that are transportation are machines that need energy to move. That's the way we should think about it. Okay, so where does the energy we use come from? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And there are two major sources. There's non-renewable energy, which is nuclear, coal, natural gas, and oil. And then there's renewable energy, which is geothermal and solar and wind and hydropower and biomass. And so these are the two different types. And I'm going to go into each one. So let's start with non-renewable energy. Non-renewable energy is finite. That means there is a limited supply of it, and it cannot get replenished in our lifetime. So there's only so much we can use. So we have uranium for nuclear energy that's used to create nuclear reaction and make nuclear energy. But what we're going to look at are the fossil fuels. And this is coal, this top left, and then top right is natural gas. And then this bottom picture here is oil, crude oil. And I want us to think, I'm just going to ask this question for you to think about before I give you the answer in the next slide, is where do we think fossil fuels come from? Are they A, from dead plants and ocean life, B, from dinosaurs, or C, from volcanoes? Because the reason I'm asking is a lot of people think it's B. A lot of people think that fossil fuels come from dinosaurs. And so if you hear somebody say that, you can now answer, no, the answer is dead plants and ocean life. And I'm going to play this video for everyone so we can get a sense of how that came to be. All right, so let's watch this video.
Fossil fuels. Fossil fuel is a term used to describe a group of energy sources that were formed from ancient plants and organisms during the Carboniferous period approximately 360 to 286 million years ago, even before the age of dinosaurs. At that time, the land was covered with swamps filled with organisms and plants. As they died, they sank to the bottom of swamps and oceans and over millions of years started decomposing under layers of sand, clay, and other minerals. Different types of fossil fuels formed depending on the combination of organic matter, temperature, time, and pressure conditions while decomposing. There are three major types of fossil fuels: coal, oil, and natural gas. Coal was formed from ferns, plants, and trees, which hardened due to pressure and heat. Oil was formed from small organisms like zooplankton and algae, where pressure caused the more complex organic matter to decompose. Natural gas was formed by the same process as oil, only it was exposed to more heat and pressure, causing it to further decompose and turn into a gaseous form. Fossil fuels are sought-after energy sources because they have a high energy density. They are the world's dominant energy source. Fossil fuels have a variety of applications from electricity production to transport fuels.
All right, I'm stopping there because that's what we're going to talk about over the next few slides. So, fossil fuels, we now know how they're made and how they were formed, but then you have to get them out of the ground. And there are two basic ways in which we do this. For natural gas and for oil, we have to drill them out of the ground, and then for coal, we have to mine it. And so what I've shown here are examples of where are the biggest of each of these in the world. So if we're looking at a natural gas field, where is the biggest natural gas field? It's in South Pars, which is it's in the Persian Gulf, and that is between Iran and Qatar. So that's where you'll find the biggest natural gas field in the world. The biggest oil field in the world, you'll find in Saudi Arabia, the Ghawar field. And then the biggest coal mine in the world is actually in Wyoming in the US. It's called the North Antelope Rochelle coal mine. So we have to get the fossil fuels out of the ground. And then once they're out of the ground, we have to transport them. And they can be transported a really long way. And so I've given some examples here as well, because they can go by pipeline for oil and gas. They can go by train for coal and sometimes oil, and they can also go by ship. And all of these fossil fuels can go via ship all the way across the world. So let's just take a look at just how far we can transport some of these things. So for example, the longest gas pipeline in the world is the Friendship pipeline, and it carries, the largest oil pipeline, I apologize, in the world is a Friendship pipeline. It carries oil some 2,500 miles from the eastern part of Russia all across Europe. And so I want to give people a comparison. The US all the way across is 2,800 miles. So that pipeline goes nearly all the way across, what would be the equivalent of the entire US from coast to coast. And then down below is the West-East gas pipeline. That's in China. It is the world's longest gas pipeline. It's 5,656 miles long, and it goes through no fewer than 66 cities in China. So it goes a really long way. And then I wanted to give an example of a coal train, because the longest coal train that we know of was over 500 cars and was over 4 miles long. That's a really long train. And actually, if you've ever seen a coal train go by, they can go by for minutes and minutes and minutes. They can be really long. And then the bottom picture I wanted to show you was an oil tanker. This one was called the Knock Nevis. It was the largest oil tanker ever built. It was 1,540 feet long. That's 50 feet longer than the Empire State Building is tall. So these are really big infrastructure projects, and we can take these fossil fuels a long way. So we've talked about non-renewable energy, and now I want to talk about renewable energy, because that's energy that's produced from sources that do not deplete and can be replenished within a human's lifetime. So what are the examples? I'm going to go from the top, kind of go in a clockwise direction here. So we're going to start with hydropower, which comes from water. And then on the top right is geothermal. And that's from natural heat that's down underground. So the geothermal heat that comes from underground. And then we have wind turbines, which produce wind energy, solar panels, which take energy from the sun. And then here is biomass, and that incorporates a number of different things, agricultural waste, wood, plant products. All of these things are considered to be biomass energy. And these are the different things that we think of when we're talking about renewable energy. And so what I wanted to do here was give a quick video that kind of gives a nice overview, I think, of renewable energy versus fossil fuel energy and sort of what are the benefits. So let's start this video and watch this for a couple of minutes.
Around the world, renewable energy use is on the rise. And these alternative energy sources could hold the key to combating climate change. What is renewable energy? Renewable energy is generated from sources that naturally replenish themselves and never run out. The most common sources are solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and biomass. Over 80% of the total energy consumed by humans is derived from fossil fuels. However, renewables are the fastest growing source of energy in the world. Renewable energy has many benefits. First, it can combat climate change because it creates no direct greenhouse gas emissions. The only emissions that they produce are indirect, meaning those that result from manufacturing parts, installation, operation, and maintenance. But even those are minimal. Second, renewable energy can decrease pollution and therefore reduce threats to our health. Wind, solar, and hydroelectric systems create no air pollution emissions, and geothermal and biomass energy systems emissions are much lower than non-renewable energy sources. Third, renewable energy is a reliable source of power. Because renewable energy sources are, well, renewable, they will never run out. Once built, renewable facilities cost very little to operate, and the fuel is often free. As a result, renewable energy prices tend to be stable over time. While renewable energy has many advantages, it is not without downsides. It is difficult for renewable energy sources to generate power on the same large scale as fossil fuels. Building wind farms and dams can disrupt wildlife and migration patterns and lead to ecological destruction. Both solar and wind energy are intermittent. They only generate power while the sun is shining or while the wind is blowing. Batteries can store excess energy for later use. However, they are often costly. While renewable energy presents some challenges, it also offers an environmentally friendly alternative to the greenhouse gas emissions and pollution of fossil fuels. And as advances in technology make renewable energy more accessible, affordable, and efficient, an end to climate change could be within our reach.
All right, so that gave us a really good overview of the benefits and advantages of renewable energy, and then some of the downsides or things that have been challenges so far. And then in the way that I did with the oil and gas and coal, I also wanted to show you on the left here is the world's largest solar farm. It's the Bhadla Solar Park in India, and it has 4 million solar panels. And on the right is the Jiuquan wind power base in China. That's the world's largest wind farm, and it has over 7,000 turbines. So also really big projects are happening now on the renewable side too. So what we've done is we've talked about what are the various energy sources. I've gone over the non-renewable ones, and I've also gone over the renewable ones, but we have to take those energy sources and we have to make them into the things that we use, such as electricity or the fuel for our car. And so this first part I want to explain, or use the video to explain, is how we get those energy sources to make electricity. So we're just going to watch what will explain to us how the energy source goes into what's called a power plant, and how that then makes electricity that comes to our homes.
The flick of a switch. That's how easy it is to get electricity, right? If you're one of the lucky ones, then yes. But in 2017, there are still over 1 billion people who do not have access to electricity. In this video, we will discuss how electricity is generated and transferred to our homes, for those of us fortunate enough to have it. There are a variety of ways in which electricity is generated or made. How many can you think of? Some are shown in this image. Solar panels, wind turbines, biomass, hydroelectric, nuclear, and fossil fuels. And then there is also geothermal energy, tidal power, and wave power as well. Except for burning fossil fuels and nuclear, the rest are renewable sources of energy. Currently, about 80% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels. First, we're going to have a look at burning fossil fuels in power stations to generate energy. And then we'll look at the national grid, which is relevant for both non-renewable and renewable energies. So, fossil fuels in power stations. Most power stations use coal as an energy source, and they work in the following way. 1. Coal is burned in a power station. The heat produced as the coal burns is used to heat water. The water boils and turns into steam. 2. This steam is used to turn the blades of a turbine. A turbine looks like a fan or a wind turbine. The turbine turns a generator. Inside, wires turn within magnets to generate electricity. So that was a fossil fuel power station. These next steps are for energy generated from any source, whether it's fossil fuels or renewable, like wind-powered substations or biomass-fueled. 4. The electricity, whether renewable or not, is passed through transformers and wires within the national grid that carries it to our homes. So, what exactly is the national grid? The national grid is a system of cables and transformers linking power stations to consumers. Have you ever felt an electrical wire and noticed it gets hot? This is because some energy travelling through the wire is lost as heat. In order to lose as little energy as possible, transformers are used. When the electricity leaves the power station, it passes through a step-up transformer. A step-up transformer increases the voltage and reduces the current. Reducing the current makes the transfer of electricity more efficient, as less energy is lost as heat. Before the electricity gets to our homes, the voltage needs to be reduced back down to a safe level. The electricity therefore passes through a step-down transformer.
All right, so I just want to go through that process on the next slide because it's a little bit complicated, but I want us to look through. And what we have is, again, as he was explaining, the power plant generates the electricity, and then it gets stepped up, it creates the electricity, and it gets stepped up in voltage to go through these high voltage transmission lines. This is, I'm showing on the diagram on the left side. And you may have actually seen these. If you've ever been driving by a highway, you can often see them. There are these high voltage transmission lines. And to give you a sense of just how far power can be transported across them, I put up the fact that the world's longest power transmission line is the 1,524-mile Belo Monte, Rio de Janeiro power line in Brazil. So again, if we're thinking about the US being 2,800 miles from coast to coast, that's, you know, a little bit over halfway all the way across the US the transmission line can go. So it's like it can go, you know, we take power long distances. And then it comes through those lines and it goes to a substation, which are these things, which you also may have seen around. And this is a slide you can reference back now that you're going to be able to identify what all this infrastructure is. You can start to see it around you. And then it goes through these distribution lines. So that's sort of the bottom middle slide. These are distribution lines. You may have seen these in your neighborhood, or if you're visiting a neighborhood that has, you can take a look up and see. And then right here on the very right are these distribution transformers, they're called. And those little cylinders on the poles, they take the voltage and then they bring that voltage down so it can go and go into your homes and apartments and you know, power all the appliances that we use and need. So that's how we get the power from the power plant, or the energy from the power plant through to our homes. It's a little bit complicated, but I want you to start looking out, and you'll probably be able to spot this infrastructure around you. Now you know what it is, and you can explain to your grown-ups too. So the other thing I mentioned was that we have energy that goes into transportation fuels. So if you've ever been to a gas station, had a car filled up, or you've been seen trucks going by, been on the subway or a train, they all use transportation fuels, and those don't get made in a power plant. Those are actually made in a refinery. And so we take oil, which was one of those fossil fuels, and you remember the biggest oil field was in Saudi Arabia, and it can get transported by pipeline or sometimes rail or go into a crude tanker. Well, one of the places it goes is to a refinery. And in a refinery, they create different products from that crude oil. And so that's where you'll get gasoline for your cars, diesel for trucks, fuel oil for ships, and heating oil that can go into some homes. We actually use heating oil for a lot of homes up in the northeast of the US. But most of the things that come out of a refinery are for transportation. And so those are where the fuels come. That go into cars and buses and trains and everything else. So we've spoken a lot, I've mentioned where the different sources of energy come from, non-renewable and renewable, how they get to your home. And the great thing is that you, even as a kid, can help save energy. And not only does it save money, but it helps the planet. As we talk, we were talking about fossil fuels in particular and emissions that are caused, but you can actually really do something. And here are some of the ways in which you can save energy. One is to turn lights off when you're leaving your room. That's a big one. And as you're leaving your room, just make sure all your lights are off. The other one is keeping your fridge door closed. If you go to get a snack, you get some milk, make sure you close your fridge behind you. Another one is sometimes we don't always have to turn our lights on right away. Sometimes daylight can help us. We can get some use from natural light and save on lighting as well. You can ask a grown-up to help unplug appliances when they're not in use. Or if you have something charging, like a Chromebook or an iPad, you can unplug it when it's fully charged. That helps too. And then the big one, and this is why I mentioned that when we were looking at what are the major sources of energy use in our homes, and it was heating and cooling, a really big thing you can do is make sure you shut doors and windows, certainly in rooms you're not using, or when you leave the house, you can make sure that you have your door closed, because that way you stop heat getting out or cool air getting out. And that's a really, really big way that you can save energy. And the same with closing, shutting windows is another one. So there are others. So I put up a question of people that can think of others. Some other ones I can think of are making sure you turn a tap off. If you're brushing your teeth, you don't need to run it the whole time. You could take shorter showers. You don't have to have really big baths. So there are other ways that we can save energy that we can start to think about. So I have spoken for quite some time, and I want to let you all have a chance to ask questions. So I'm going to open this up for questions now.
Great, thank you, Erin. So just a reminder to our viewers, we're trying out a new question submission platform today. The way to submit questions is to go to onlinequestions.org. The online questions, one word, no capital letters, and enter the event number for this particular event, which is today's date, so 42720. So we have a couple of questions ready to go, and if there are more questions, please submit them through the site, or just email me directly if you're having issues. So Erin, one of the first questions was actually, is there a way to make light without electricity? I think this came up at the beginning.
Is there a way to make light without? Well, you can use batteries, right, and have a battery controlled lamp if you want. Or as I said, one of the ways you can save energy is to try to use as much daylight. Sort of sit near a window, or that's one option. But generally, it's I think sometimes you've seen, maybe if you have an emergency kit, like you have a wind-up, you can use a wind-up light, but in general, most of our lights use electricity.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is whether or not we should all buy hybrid or electric cars to try and reduce our energy use.
You can certainly you can do that if you have the means. There's definitely helpful. I would say that we've seen electric cars come a really long way, and one of the constraints we say to electric cars has been that you can't usually drive incredibly long distances without needing to recharge. And what we don't have, certainly in the US, is sort of very like a lot of charging stations all across the US. So we're sort of lacking what's called a charging infrastructure, which means there are some places you can drive and you can charge your electric vehicle if you've gone a couple hundred miles, but there are other places where it's not as easy to do that. So it's definitely, and for some people who make the decision, they do it because they're driving within a certain range every day, and it makes a lot of sense to be able to plug in and charge your car and just drive in that range. So, but they are expensive in general, so just be warned. I don't know what your allowance is, but
yeah, that is not something that the Earth Institute is going to endorse, that all students ask their parents about buying electric cars. As someone, so the next question is more about your role, and as someone who works in energy in this particular field, what are some of the really cool or interesting projects you've gotten to work on? Have you traveled to some really fun places? You've gotten to meet really fun people while you're working in this field?
Oh, okay, that's a great question. So I've gotten to see a lot of the big infrastructure that I was talking about in some of those slides. Whether it's ports or gas import terminals or oil storage tankers or visit refineries. Those are some of the really interesting places that I've gotten to go as part of my job. And then I've been able to meet a lot of people who are really doing really interesting things on how do we get our energy sector to be more sustainable, to use more renewable energy. And there was one part of that video that talked about energy storage, so we're trying to find batteries to store, or we're starting to use batteries to store some of our renewable energy. And some of the people I've gotten to meet are the people who are really at the forefront of that technology and trying to build it up to a big scale so that we can have more and more of our power come from renewables and not have it be as intermittent. So when the sun goes down, the battery power can take over and allow us to have renewable energy sustain the power grid for longer. So those are sort of some of the really cool people I've gotten to speak to.
Okay, great. So our next questions are related to sort of promising renewable resources. The first is about tidal energy. What are the prospects of using this in the US, and has it been used successfully anywhere else in the world?
So I would have to admit that I'm not as up to speed on tidal energy. I think, obviously we're constrained as to location, right? You have to be near where there are tides and harness that. What has generally, and there are projects around the world that use tidal energy. A lot of times what has been an issue has been you can create the energy, but then you have to get it to where you need it to go. And that's often been a challenge with things like tidal energy, is that you then have to get it to where the demand is, where you saw all those lights lighting up, right, in various places around the world. And that can be a bit of a challenge. But I have to admit, I am not as up to speed on exactly where the projects would be globally that have, you know, and what our potential is. I think we have more potential in the US from things like offshore wind energy, because we can really start to scale that up and make, you know, increasingly big offshore wind projects, as well as, you know, onshore solar, onshore wind. Those are really, I think, where people get excited about the opportunities within the US in particular.
Okay, great. And sort of another form of renewable, or another form of energy, you know, why someone has asked why nuclear energy is such a debated sort of energy source. If you could give us a little more information on that.
These are such great questions. You should come and partake in our events.
Yeah.
So that's such a good question, because renewable energy doesn't produce any CO2 emissions. So there are no greenhouse gas emissions from nuclear energy. But the problem is that when I use that uranium and I put it through the process, I create nuclear waste. And there is nothing that we can do right now to sort of effectively deal with nuclear waste. And it can stay very radioactive for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so right now we have a lot of nuclear waste that's sort of on site at nuclear plants, and we don't have a good way to, you know, there's some in Europe, they do some nuclear recycling, but we just don't have very good ways of addressing the waste from it. So while it's clean now and we can really enjoy, we can say, well, we're enjoying no emissions, we're sort of leaving a big nuclear waste problem for really future generations to have to deal with. And that's where you get a lot of the debate around nuclear energy.
Okay. Great, thanks for that explanation. We have one question sort of going back to electric cars. Do self-driving cars take more energy?
Well, that's interesting, because it really depends on how they're used. So if you have let's say we have a future where a self-driving car doesn't belong to somebody in particular, and it's used to really intelligently collect 4 people and carpool them and pull them back, then it absolutely uses less energy. If it's used so that you can sit in the back of your car and take 5-hour commutes every day because you don't have to drive, then it's using more energy. Not that you would commute 5 hours a day, but if you wanted to commute longer, you could, and have your autonomous car drive you there and back and not have to worry about public transport. So I guess I would answer that. It really just depends on how we use them.
Okay, great. The next question is more about yourself. So this person would like to hear a little bit about your education and your background. How did you get to where you are today in your career? And sort of what inspired you to follow this path into the energy field?
All right, another good question. So I went to college, and I took economics as my major in college. And I really liked anything that was sort of political and involved people consuming it, and was there enough supply? And then when I was thinking about what I wanted to do sort of with my career, I was thinking about trade as one area that I might like to go into. And for whatever reason, I went to, I had started actually at Columbia at the School of International Public Affairs as a master's degree in economic policy. And I had thought, well, this is a good, you know, I like economics and this will be a good place. And they had an energy concentration at the time. And it was so interesting to me. I started to take classes in that concentration, and I was just enthralled. I thought energy was everything. It has geopolitics, like how different countries interact, and trade and economics and supply, and it has environmental aspects to it. And really, once I left my graduate program, I started working covering energy right after that at an independent research firm. And I've just always found it to be, it's never boring. There's always something happening. And I think it's a very misunderstood subject. I think, we were talking, you'd be surprised how many adults do not know where their power comes from in their homes, or how do you get the fuels that you put in transportation. I think there are a lot of ways in which energy is misunderstood. So that's kind of what's kept me really intrigued with this area my whole life.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to remind our sort of remaining viewers here, if you do have additional questions, please either email me directly or send it to the online questions.org. Erin, you touched upon this a little bit in the presentation about energy and transportation, and thinking about public transportation, especially in New York City, where we're seeing sort of a switch to sort of hybrid or electric vehicles. Do you think that trend will continue, and how important is it for sort of public transit to also be considering renewable energy sources?
Public transport is absolutely a perfect place to be considering electric, and for the exact reason that I was talking about, which is you don't face those constraints of where do you find infrastructure to charge, because it's all centralized. And you don't have to worry about range, right? You're not driving 300 miles in your bus. You have a fixed transportation route you take every day on a schedule. It lends itself very well as an infrastructure, or for public transportation to move in the direction of hybrid and electric, because it doesn't have those issues that we face with sort of long haul or long distance transport. And it also is really good, as I was talking, showing that we're really seeing this growth in renewable, or the video mentioned, we're seeing a lot of growth in renewable energy. And with that means we get a lot of energy produced, sometimes in the middle of the day when not so many people need it. So sometimes there's a ton of sun, or there's a lot of wind at night. And one way we can really capture that renewable energy when there isn't as much demand for it is by using the transport, like plugged in vehicles to take power at that point, right? To create, to sort of use that time to take power when there isn't a lot of other demand for it. So it can work really well as all part of a system. And I think that we're going to increasingly absolutely see cities move that way. And I would argue, we're seeing right now what it's like for cities to not have air pollution from cars and trucks and things. And so we've seen what LA can look like. And I think that's going to help it, right? I mean, within a couple of weeks. And it's a really interesting, if you want to look, I suggest everybody take a look at images of cities right now and how they looked a couple months ago. And it really will help, I think, accelerate how we think about what sustainable public transport is in urban areas, definitely.
Right. Thank you. There's a question about you showed a map earlier about the number of individuals in the world, particularly sort of the African continent, individuals who don't necessarily have access and are living without access to energy. Do you know if what steps are being taken to sort of connect them to the rest of the world? What kinds of funds are needed to go into the infrastructure?
So what is another great development, I think, that we've seen in really the last 5 to 10 years, probably closer on the five-year side, is the cost coming down, sort of the solar energy in particular, because what we're sort of thinking, and there are others who are much more, who have a lot more expertise on this, but there are ways in which, instead of having to build a big power grid, right, that I was showing that we have in the US with our big power plants and our transmission lines and, you know, distribution and everything else, is you can do what's called microgrids or community solar, where you take everything on a much smaller scale. And so you say, look, here are areas where they may not have access. And we are seeing a lot of NGOs and development organizations that realize that energy access is a key component to development, right? Because all those things I talked about are so key: refrigeration, right? And, you know, sanitation, being able to stay to edge for electrification, like all of those things are really important in our development, for our development. And so if we can, you know, we can start to see investment. We are seeing investment in these like microgrids, community solar, where it's not trying to create a massive infrastructure that's going to be very, very, very costly and challenging. It's really sort of trying to address these things on a more local level. And I think that's going to be how it's done. I don't have an estimate for what the kind of costs are. I can probably try to see if I can find. I imagine it's going to be a lot to get a billion people electricity, but a lot less than if we were trying to build a really big infrastructure grid.
Right. Great. And this is sort of related to something you already said, you know, in terms of energy costs being lower than they used to be. And how do you balance that with, you know, continuing, you know, I know, at least for me personally, I've read that, you know, economic growth on one hand and cost of energy and low cost of energy. And so how do you think stakeholders have to balance that?
It's a good question. And I think that was a harder question for us before renewable energy became really cheap. And, you know, even again, 5 years ago, it was a much different picture when you were sort of saying, well, do you want to grow economically or do you want to be environmentally sound? And then I think we saw two things happen. One was that renewable energy became, in fact, the most cost competitive. If we look at, you know, often wind, solar, it can be some of the cheapest forms of energy now, just in the way their costs have come down over the last 5 years. And then the other thing was we started to see what happened when you tried for economic growth and you didn't focus on the environment and the impact that had on countries like China and India, and the pollution, the air pollution, and what that meant in terms of starting to see schools closed and airports closed, right, because of air pollution. That's hard for your economic growth too. So I think what we've started to see is it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both. And certainly the cost of, you know, going with cleaner fuels is now an affordable option. So I think it's easier to make that balance.
Great, thank you. So I was thinking about asking you, you know, if as we're finishing up our session here, are there specific activities that students may be able to do at home with their parents that are energy related? And then sort of my first question was actually a question that I had. How do you actually read your electric bill? Because I think it's that could be something that students and their parents or you know, guardians at home could practice doing to, you know, think about how much energy they're using in their homes. How can they measure that over time? That might be something fun to try. Any tips for things that we should be paying attention to? I know you mentioned specifically, you know, strategies to take at home to try and reduce your energy consumption. But curious if there are other things that we could do to specifically measure, or, you know, a lot of schools have done energy audits to try and assess what energy levels are and consumption is like. Any tips for how someone might do that at home to try and track their activities? Just trying to think about activities and follow-up stuff that our viewers can be doing at home.
Great question. So a couple of things, like usually on your electricity bill, it will tell you, you know, what your usage has been, and often it will compare it. You can see a comparison over, you know, previous months, you know, what you've been consuming. I believe it's usually you get, you know, it actually shows you the quantity of energy that you've been consuming. So it's one thing to look at. A lot of times, if you have, for example, Con Edison is your energy provider, you can go on Con Edison's website and do like they'll let you sort of, you can do an energy audit of your own home. So you can kind of count through, and they should, usually most of them will offer this, where you should be able to find, and you can kind of look at, what are things you can do in your own home? Do you have, light bulbs that you could switch perhaps, or are there drafts that you could perhaps like try to, maybe put some duct tape around or something, seal up, but they usually have some solutions. And then a lot of things that people will suggest are, maybe talking with your parents about, when do we run our dishwasher, right? Should we do it, set it on a delay setting so that it's running in the middle of the night, and that tends to make costs. So there are two things you can really work on. One is the overall energy use that you use day to day. And then the other is, when do you use it? Like, are you using it when it costs a lot more, or can you use it at cheaper times of day, which is sort of later in the day, and then, delay, like I said, delay appliances, so they're in the night. And you can usually see that in your electricity bill. Like, if you start doing some of these things, there are other things that they suggest, like you can get a timer for your shower, or you can just use a regular timer on a phone or something that says, I don't take a shower that's more than 7 minutes, right? And then the alarm goes off. And I know with my own children, a shower, anything could go on for a lot longer than that. So you have to take, you can make steps that really could have an impact. And you could look at that bill, and usually it's done. They have a graph that shows you, so it's pretty clear to see if you're reducing your energy usage.
Okay. Great. All great things that we can try at home and activities to do.
And I would, just if I had to give one more activity, I think a great thing, and I don't know if I have to share my screen again quickly.
Might have to.
Let's see, maybe I've lost it. Let me share screen, is to do, can we see this? Is a poster.
Yep.
So I just, if people are interested in doing that, I think it's a great way to sort of remember some of the things that we talked about. I think it's a fun activity to do, and it can help remind everybody in your home about ways you can save energy and around the house, and also help the planet.
Yeah, that's great. And if you do actually end up making a poster, feel free to share that with us. We'd love to feature it on a future blog post or tweet about it as a result of this session. So we have one last question before we go, and this is back to sort of electric vehicles. So although electric cars give off zero emissions, they still need power plants to generate the electricity that's being used to charge them. How much energy is being used to charge them compared to the energy to refine gasoline?
So
very specific question.
Very specific question.
Yeah.
And the answer is, it depends on where you are. You definitely use a lot less energy overall, even if you're plugged into the grid and an electric car, than you do from gasoline. So it's definitely much more efficient no matter where you are. There are some places in the US, like if you were in the southeast of the United States, probably most of the power that you're getting is coming from coal. So that's gonna be a little bit different in measuring sort of the overall emissions profile, even of an electric car. But then there are other places like in California where you're getting a lot of your electricity is coming from renewables. And so you're just using a much, much cleaner overall source of energy, even if you're plugging in plugging in an electric car. So it has a little bit of a variation, but in general, you're going to be a lot more efficient. It's a lot more efficient to use an electric car than a regular gasoline car.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Any last or any concluding comments you want to make before we wrap up?
I just hope this was useful for everybody, and I really keep your eyes open. Energy infrastructure really is all around us, and kind of once you know what the pieces are, it's sort of fun to be able to spot them. So I hope that you are now able to look around and say, I know what I know what that is.
Yeah.
So that's all.
Great. Well, thank you, Erin, for your time, taking the time to do this. If any of you have additional questions that you'd like to ask but maybe didn't get a chance to, feel free to send them over to me. We'll make sure that Erin gets them. And as I mentioned, this was recorded, so in a couple of days, we'll share a link to this video, and we'll make sure that it's available for you to also view at a later time. And if you do end up making a poster, do send us a photo of what you end up creating. We'd love to see it. So thank you again for joining us today for EI Live, the K-12 edition. And we will see you for our next session on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Thank you again, Erin, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.